The weirdest part about Polymarket is this. The thing people call a prediction market can sometimes feel less like a crystal ball and more like a confidence trick wearing a lab coat. Not always a scam in the criminal sense, but sometimes a scam in the everyday sense. A system that sounds way more certain, neutral, and scientific than it actually is. And yeah, that's the whole twist. These markets can be useful, but the shiny wisdom of the crowd story leaves out the part where crowds can be manipulated, insiders can have an edge, and regulators can spend years arguing over what, exactly, this thing even is. So here's the question nobody asks fast enough. If prediction markets are so smart, why have they been in legal trouble? Why do they keep colliding with gambling laws? And why do so many of the loudest claims about them sound a little too perfect? And even more important, if the price of a contract is supposed to represent the probability of an event, what happens when the people trading it have better information than everybody else, or just better motives to lie? By the end of this video, you'll know how these markets actually work, why they were invented, why some researchers love them, and why critics say the entire category can slide into a very polished form of legalized speculation. Alright, simple version. A prediction market is just a market where people trade contracts tied to future events. If the event happens, the contract pays out. If it doesn't, it doesn't. The current price of that contract is treated like the crowd's estimate of the odds. So if a contract trades at 40 cents, the market is basically saying the event has about a 40% chance of happening. That idea is elegant and honestly kind of beautiful, because instead of asking people what they think, you let them put money behind it. The big pitch, historically, was that markets are better than polls because people with real knowledge have a reason to act on it. That's the whole Robin Hanson-style argument. If you want better information, build a market that rewards people for being right. The theory is simple. When enough traders compete, the price should aggregate all the scattered scraps of information floating around in the world. That's why prediction markets got attention from economists, futurists, and companies trying to forecast anything from elections to product launches. And this isn't brand new internet wizardry. The CFTC says prediction markets in the United States have existed since 1988 and have been regulated by the agency since 2004. And academic history traces earlier corporate and experimental prediction market efforts back decades before Polymarket ever showed up. So when people talk about Polymarket like it invented the concept, that's already a little off. Polymarket is a newer, flashier version of a much older idea, one that has always lived at the border between forecasting, gambling, finance, and regulatory discomfort. Polymarket launched in 2020, founded by Shane Copeland, right in the middle of pandemic-era internet chaos, when everyone was online, everyone had an opinion, and everyone was looking for a way to turn certainty into cash. The product was easy to grasp. Buy yes or no shares on real-world events, watch the odds move, and let the market speak. That simplicity was the genius. But simplicity is also where the danger starts. Because if the interface is easy enough, people stop asking what legal structure is underneath the button they're clicking. Here's where the story gets messy. In January 2022, the CFTC announced a settlement with Polymarket's operator, finding that the platform had offered off-exchange, event-based binary options contracts without proper registration and requiring a $1.4 million civil penalty and a wind-down of non-compliant markets. That matters because it shows the platform wasn't just in a philosophical gray area, it was in an actual regulatory one. Polymarket later kept evolving, but the core tension never went away. Is this a market, a derivative platform, or just gambling with nicer branding? To regulators, that question is not academic. The CFTC says event contracts can be swaps, futures, or something that falls under a registration and oversight framework. And prediction markets can be used for hedging or speculation. That means the legal label determines who gets to watch, what kind of rules apply, and whether a platform can legally offer certain contracts to the public. And once sports, elections, wars, and corporate events get bundled into one app, you've got a product that feels consumer-friendly, but behaves like a hybrid of finance, wagering, and public forecasting. Now, to be fair, the success story isn't fake. A lot of research does show that prediction markets can perform well as aggregators of dispersed information, and some studies find they can be competitive with or better than other forecasting methods in certain settings. But that doesn't mean they're magic. It means they can be good at turning knowledge into price. When the market is liquid, the rules are stable, the participants are informed, and nobody has a massive incentive to bend the result. Scientifically, the reason these markets can work is pretty straightforward. Incentives sharpen attention. People tend to reveal what they believe when they can profit from being right, and a market price can become a compressed summary of lots of private information. That's useful because humans are terrible at holding all the relevant details in their heads at once. But science also tells us something less flattering. Incentives can be gamed, information can be asymmetric, and people will absolutely lie, bluff, and coordinate if the payoff is big enough. And this is where the scam vibe starts to make more sense. In prediction markets, if somebody has non-public information, they can often place a bet before everyone else catches up. That isn't automatically illegal in every context, but it creates a huge fairness problem and a huge credibility problem. In 2026, legal analysis and commentary around the space made clear that insider trading style concerns and fraud theories are now very much part of the prediction market conversation, especially when contracts touch corporate events or sensitive public outcomes. There's also the manipulation problem. A market can be temporarily pushed around by someone with enough money, enough volume, or enough motive to create a false signal. Sometimes the manipulation fails and the market snaps back. Sometimes it leaves a misleading impression long enough to influence people reading the odds like they're holy scripture. And that's the sneaky part. The public often treats the displayed probability as a fact, when it's really just a moving price produced by fallible humans with wallets. Quick question for you. If a market says something has a 70% chance, do you think people trust it because it's actually accurate, or because it just sounds more scientific than a poll? Drop your answer in the comments because honestly, that distinction is the entire game here. Okay, pause. Let's strip the hype out of it for 1 second. A prediction market is not a magic brain, not a government oracle, and not proof that the internet knows best. It is a mechanism, and like any mechanism, it works best under certain conditions and gets weird under others. The difference between those two states is basically the whole story of Polymarket, Kalshi, and the entire prediction market boom. By 2025 and 2026, prediction markets were no longer a niche curiosity. They were a legal and commercial battleground, with debate over federal versus state authority, sports-related contracts, and the boundary between regulated event trading and gambling. That matters because once a market grows large enough, it stops being a quirky forecasting tool and starts becoming infrastructure. And infrastructure gets regulated, challenged, and litigated, usually a lot. So why do people still love prediction markets? Because when they work, they can surface truth faster than punditry, polls, or vibes. Traders with actual knowledge often have skin in the game, And that changes behavior in a way ordinary social media never can. If you're trying to gauge whether a policy will pass, whether a CEO will resign, or whether a major event is likely, a live market can be incredibly informative. The catch is that informative is not the same thing as clean. Critics, though, see something harsher. They argue that the product benefits from the aura of objectivity while often operating inside legal ambiguity, user confusion, and behavioral exploitation. That's why some people describe the whole thing as a scam, not necessarily because every contract is fake, but because the branding can overpromise certainty while the underlying system is still vulnerable to all the usual human mess: greed, asymmetry, legal loopholes, and narrative manipulation. Scientifically speaking, the best version of the truth is usually probabilistic, not absolute. Prediction markets capture that beautifully when the market is healthy, but a probability is only as honest as the participants, the rules, and the quality of the resolution process. If the contract definition is fuzzy, if the market is thin, or if the crowd is full of people trying to game the system, then that probability starts to wobble like a shopping cart with one bad wheel. So here's the real answer. Polymarket and prediction markets are not pure scams, and they're not pure wisdom either. They're powerful tools that can tell you something real about what informed people believe. But they also create a market for influence, speculation, and regulatory gamesmanship. That's why the most honest description is probably the least glamorous one. Prediction markets are useful, but fragile. And once you see that, the hype starts to look a lot smaller. The next question is the really juicy one. If prediction markets can be useful and exploitable at the same time, what does a truly trustworthy version even look like? Because that answer is going to decide whether this becomes a serious forecasting tool, a regulated financial product, or just the slickest betting app ever invented. And that, honestly, is where the story gets even more interesting.